It is rather naive to analyze current geopolitical events only in the context of current time frame. Geopolitical events are influenced by past events. If we fail to acknowledge this, we won't be able to analyze the current events, and more importantly, we would fail to foresee future ramifications. In this episode of Alternative Perspective, I expose a Zionist agenda and Anglo-French deception and treachery that is at the heart of Russia-Ukraine conflict. It is extremely important for the government of India and its policymakers and think tanks to keep this in the perspective. This has tremendous future ramifications. In 1907, a tripartite agreement was completed between the French, the British Empire, and the Russian Empire. This agreement is known as Triple Entente. Triple Entente essentially was a geopolitical, military, and strategic alliance that set the stage for the First World War, which would start in 1914. Triple Entente formed the nucleus of Allied power comprising of France, British Empire, and the Russian Empire. Later, Italy and United States of America to join the Allied forces in 1915 and 1917 respectively. Axis power, on the other hand, comprised of Imperial Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Ottoman Turk Empire. Bulgaria to join the Axis forces in 1915. Now you know that the groundwork for this kind of geopolitical mega events start years before the commencement of the actual event. For example, the preparation for the pandemic started in the year 1998 and it was set into motion in the year 2012, but that's a different issue altogether. Anyway, coming back to the Triple Entente, British and the French deceived the Russians by promising them Istanbul or Constantinople in the event Allied forces managed to win. British and the French persuaded and convinced the Russians to join the Allied forces by promising them Istanbul in the event of an Allied victory. This was a deception. Originally, Constantinople was the capital of Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire. Once it was taken over by the Ottoman Turks, its name got changed to Istanbul. During the First World War, it was Russia which took most of the pain. It suffered the highest number of deaths and casualties. Russia had to bear with staggering loss of lives. Russia's economy suffered a huge setback. Inflation or price rise was unbearable for common Russians. However, Russia was making good gains on the ground. By 1917, Ottoman Turk Empire was collapsing to the much delight of the British and the French. Germany and Austro-Hungarian Empire was stuck in a trench warfare with Russians on Russia's western flank. However, most importantly, Russian army was at the doorstep of Istanbul, which was previously known as Constantinople. As the Russian army was about to take Istanbul, Jews in Russia and Ukraine started the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, and the Bolshevik uprising would impose communism upon Russia. Bolshevik Revolution was organized by the Jews and crypto-Jews of Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe. Most of the frontline leaders of Bolshevik Revolution were Jews or crypto-Jews for that matter. Most of them were actually atheist Jews or crypto-Jews. They were funded by Jewish and crypto-Jewish oligarchs and businessmen of Russia, and their filthy rich Jewish cousins settled in United States of America and Britain. Immensely rich Jewish American businessman called Jacob Schiff was one among them. He was a top brass at Kuhn Loeb and Company. Bolshevik Jews, aka communists, would overthrow the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, and would slaughter his entire family. Communist Party leader under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin and Leon Bronstein, who is more popularly known as Leon Trotsky, would take Russia out of the First World War right before the Russian army could march into Istanbul. So you can now understand the deception and treachery of the British and the French, which in essence is a Judeo-Christian empire or Western empire. They subdued the Imperial Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Ottoman Turk Empire using Russia, its manpower, its resources, its military infrastructure, and then threw Russia into a gutter by subverting them using communism, which is essentially a Jewish invention and nothing else. This is what I mean by use and throw policy of the Judeo-Christian Western Empire. Be very careful. Naturally, question comes, why the Western Empire prevented Russia from taking Istanbul? Whomsoever controls Istanbul controls Bosphorus. Bosphorus Strait connects Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, which is connected to Aegean Sea via Dardanelles Strait. Aegean Sea then opens into the Mediterranean Sea. So if you deny Russia's access to Bosphorus Strait, you deny Russia's access to Mediterranean Sea. So Russian Navy practically becomes nullified. Zionists knew that they would establish the ideological state of Israel, and they thought that by denying Russia's access or by limiting Russia's access to the Mediterranean Sea, they would end up safeguarding the interest of Israel. So you can clearly see that in 1917 itself, they had the blueprint ready for Israel. For the last 200 years, British Empire and later Anglo-American Empire have been working on idea of Zionism, whereby they would first establish the ideological state of Israel, and then they would establish the Judaic empire called Pax Judaica. Once Lenin came to power, he wasted no time in giving Crimea a special autonomous status. Once the ideological state of Israel was created in the aftermath of Second World War, Crimea was gifted to the state of Ukraine, of course within the ambit of the Soviet Union, by the communists. Bolshevik Jews, also called as communists, went on to slaughter more than 60 million, that is 6 crore ethnic Russians, most of whom were of Slavic ethnicity as per Rudolf Rummel and Benjamin Valentino. Bolshevik leader turned communist leader Vladimir Lenin orchestrated famine in Russia in 1921, which killed 5 million Russians. Apart from that, there are many instances of genocide and mass murder. One such instance was the Great Purge, orchestrated and instructed by Joseph Stalin, in which more than 1 million ethnic Russians lost their lives. Subversion of Russia through communism and the creation of the communist state called Soviet Union was aimed to serve the purpose of Pax Judaica. Establishment of the ideological state of Israel was going to be the first step towards that. This is something which I have already discussed, but I am going to explain this once more. They use a political science concept or political science tool or political science principle called Hegelian dialectic. Hegelian dialectic comprises of 3 distinctive stages or phases: thesis, also called as action or problem; antithesis, also called as reaction; and synthesis, also called as result, outcome, or solution. Using this tool, they set a narrative and push through their own agenda. They also use Hegelian dialectic in order to polarize the societies among 2 conflicting or contradictory ideologies. These ideologies, such as left-wing or right-wing ideologies, or for that matter communism and fascism, are seemingly contradictory, but they are aimed to serve the purpose of the elites. They are like the opposite sides of the same coin. Once the society gets polarized, they then orchestrate a clash or conflict among these 2 ideologies. It is this conflict that results into a synthesis, that is, a synthetic solution is obtained. Western elites, that is the Jews and crypto-Jews, oligarchs and businessmen settled in United States of America and Britain, did just that prior to the Second World War. They financed Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party. Jews ideologues propped up the idea of Aryanism, racism, and white supremacism. They financed the Nazis and created the massive German war machine. Second World War was a conflict among 2 opposing ideologies such as fascism and communism, or for that matter Nazism and communism. As per Hegelian dialectic, these 2 opposing ideologies are called thesis and antithesis. When they clash, a synthesis results. Creation of the ideological state of Israel was the synthesis or outcome of this conflict. All this time, Zionists knew pretty well that communism and Soviet Russia would be used to serve the Pax Judaica project. When it was needed, communism was imposed upon the Russians and Soviet Russia was created. When the purpose was served, Judeo-Christian Anglo-American Western hegemony and the Zionists orchestrated the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism. It was their creation, it was their invention in the first place, and they could easily collapse it whenever they wanted to do it, and that's what they did. And Ukraine departed along with Crimea because it was already gifted to Ukraine by the communists. Russia and Ukraine both agreed to operate their Black Sea naval fleet from Sevastopol. This arrangement was okay as long as Viktor Yanukovych government was in power in Ukraine. But Western intelligence would soon orchestrate people's unrest in Ukraine in 2013, which would end in a military coup. Democratically elected Viktor Yanukovych government was overthrown and Viktor Yanukovych had to flee. USA, Britain and Western powers would soon instate their puppet Petro Poroshenko, a filthy rich Ukrainian billionaire oligarch, as the president of Ukraine. This was a red flag for Russia and Vladimir Putin, as Russia's Black Sea-based naval fleet was in serious jeopardy. So Vladimir Putin decided to annex Crimea in 2014, which is a major geopolitical and strategic defeat for the Judeo-Christian Anglo-American empire in many years. Western Empire and NATO wants to regain back the initiative through another Western puppet called Volodymyr Zelensky. This ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict must be viewed from a correct perspective. Question is, why government of India's think tank must be aware of this? Right before the start of First World War, British authorities in India promised Indian leaders that they would give India the dominion status once the war is over. Dominion status implies self-rule or self-governance. During the First World War, Indian soldiers fought in the battlefields of Europe as part of British Indian Army. India suffered a staggering loss of lives. I do not want to go by the official figure. According to a report sent to the London-based Commonwealth War Graves Commission, estimated figure of death toll could be as high as 350,000. That is, these men died while fighting against the Imperial Germany, or for that matter Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the battlefields across Europe. Not only that, India's resources were exploited by the British. Food grains, iron ores, coal, wood and other minerals were plundered from India by the British in order to support British war efforts in Europe. That is, India's vast resources and manpower were exploited by the British to win a war in Europe. However, after the war was over, British didn't keep up their promise. That is, British deceived the Indians. So these are basically deceitful bastards. They didn't give India the dominion status, which saw a boost in India's freedom movement following First World War. Because by that time, the Indian leaders understood that British actually deceived them. This actually influenced Pandit Nehru's and Congress-led government's foreign policy to a great extent. Nehruji took a leading role in non-aligned movement. And now that the war cloud looms large on the horizon, they might do the same thing again. They might try to lure India by offering a permanent seat in the Security Council after the Third World War, if it unfolds at all, with promise from India that India would be with West. This would be a disaster for India. They would again deceive India because these are basically deceitful bastards. Indian government think tank must be aware of this. In mid-1970, Western intelligence and their assets in India orchestrated the JP movement, that is, Jayaprakash Narayan movement, which was led by Jayaprakash Narayan. This, along with the surge of communism in Bengal, could be seen as India's or independent India's Bolshevik revolution. It was orchestrated in order to subvert India and overthrow Mrs. Indira Gandhi-led Congress government. RSS provided the tactical, financial and organizational support in this JP movement or Jayaprakash Narayan movement, and they were handled by the Western intelligence. Morarji Desai became India's Prime Minister for a short stint. According to American award-winning investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, Morarji Desai was a CIA agent and a Western stooge. JP movement or Jayaprakash Narayan movement was a leftist movement, and it was an example of left-wing subversion. More than 30 years later, India was subverted again. In 2010, 11, 12 timeframe, through the Bharat Swabhiman movement orchestrated by Baba Ramdev and company and India Against Corruption movement orchestrated by Anna Hazare, Arvind Kejriwal and company. Both these movements had subversive agenda. Although both these movements, that is Bharat Swabhiman movement by Baba Ramdev and company, and for that matter India Against Corruption movement by Arvind Kejriwal, Anna Hazare and company, were subversive in essence, there was a slight difference. Bharat Swabhiman movement by Baba Ramdev and company was a case of right-wing subversion, while India Against Corruption movement by Anna Hazare and Arvind Kejriwal etc. was an example of left-wing subversion. However, both were orchestrated by the Western intelligence and RSS provided tactical, financial and organizational support. This is not only an attempt to overthrow the Congress-led government, but also at the same time it was an attempt to subvert the entire Indian political system by bringing in a right-wing BJP pitted against a left-wing combination of Aam Aadmi Party, Communist parties and Owaisi. So this was a classic case in which RSS, which is a Western elitist organization, tried to polarize the entire Indian political system into two poles, that is left-wing Aam Aadmi Party and right-wing BJP. That is, RSS wanted to Americanize the Indian politics by bringing in Democrat versus Republic kind of narrative, right? Western intelligence is a master of orchestrating people's unrest. They have the people like George Soros with vast wealth. Judeo-Christian Western Empire controls media and social media platforms, and they are pretty good at social engineering thanks to their large base of influencers. Roughly, during the 2010, 2011, 2012 timeframe, there were several instances of people uprising around the world. India Against Corruption movement in India, overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych government in Ukraine, Arab Springs in Arab world and in Egypt. This was done as part of West's regime change formula. And wherever this people uprising took place, many of these places today stand amid ruins and they're in a state of quagmire. And all this was orchestrated by the Western intelligence. So, what was the aim of the Western intelligence in India? Subvert India, polarize Indian society into left and right, Americanize Indian politics, keep Congress out of power, instead a puppet government in India, plunder India's resources through crony capitalists, orchestrate a civil war in India and ultimately disintegrate India. That was their main motive. Apart from that, they wanted to exploit and use India's vast wealth and manpower for the future geopolitical conflict which is unfolding now. Actually, geopolitical, military and strategic alliance for this current conflict was formulated in 2010, 11, 12 timeframe, and they wanted a government in India that would blindly support the West. Although the current Narendra Modi-led BJP-led NDA government is a pro-Western government, and although they have satisfied many of the demands of their Western bosses, they are not willing to jump into a Western alliance now that the crunch time has come, now that the war cloud is looming large on the horizon. Yes, this is a pro-Western government and they have actually satisfied many of the demands, many of the expectations of their Western bosses, but they're not really willing to jump into a conflict by joining the Western bandwagon. That has become a problem for the West. If India joins Western alliance today, Britain would declare war against Russia tomorrow. This is my understanding. It is good that the current Indian government has refrained from openly supporting the West in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. It is funny to see that after abusing Pandit Nehru, that is India's first Prime Minister, for the last 7 years, Narendra Modi has adhered to Pandit Nehru's foreign policy and embraced Pandit Nehru's non-aligned principle. If India has to take a side, it must take Russia's side. There is absolutely no other alternative. If India has to take a side, it must take Russia's side, and there is absolutely no other alternative. Russia's sovereignty and integrity ensures India's sovereignty and integrity, and there is no doubt about this fact. India's West-sponsored media, however, is full of anti-Russian propaganda and rhetorics. Leftist NDTV, rightist TV9 Bharatvarsh, and so-called neutral WION are full of anti-Russian propaganda. And when push comes to shove, this so-called left and right all show their true color. they become Western elitist. But Russia's goodwill in India is such, particularly among the common Indians, that these media outlets are not able to make much of an impact. And this is also a problem for the pro-Western BJP government. An anti-Russian stance would make it hugely unpopular among Indian masses. Already, Modi's popularity has taken a steep dive. A section of Indian media would continue with their pro-Western and anti-Russian propaganda, and they would try to create an anti-Russian sentiment among the Indian masses. And that is the reason why I'm extremely worried about the safety of our students who are still stuck in the Ukraine. Western intelligence might team up with Ukraine and harm Indian students and orchestrate a false flag operation or a psychological operation and blame it on the Russians in an effort to antagonize the Indians against the Russians. As per the Hegelian dialectic, we therefore think in a rational manner, in an analytical manner, and we must think deep. Thank you.